So I can't stop reading. I can't wait to find out what happens. This is the Canary Caper. We're ready for chapter 8, and I'm going to read chapter 8 and chapter 9 together because chapter 8 is kind of short. So let's hear the end of the book. Here we go. Dink tried to shrink into the dark space between the bushes. He could feel Josh and Ruth Rose doing the same. His heart thudded as Fred Little stepped closer. Then he stopped, took off his jacket, and hung it on a tree branch 3 feet from Dink's nose. He walked back toward the house. Josh grabbed Dink. Look, he's wearing yellow suspenders. Dink remembered where he'd seen those suspenders. He grinned at Josh. The Superman clown. And the giraffe clown, Josh whispered back. I knew I'd seen him before. They watched as Fred Little opened his gym bag. He pulled out a coil of rope and looped it around his neck. Then he picked up the long pole he'd brought with him, only it wasn't a pole. Fred Little had brought a pair of long stilts. He carefully leaned the stilts against the house and scooted up the footrests. Now about 10 feet tall, he stilt walked to a spot under a small window on the second floor. A moment later, Dink watched Fred Little slip through the window. First, he was standing there on stilts, then he was gone like a snake slithering into a hole. The stilts remaining leaned against the house. Josh was at Dink's ear. Should we? Shh, wait, Ruth Rose whispered. Suddenly, the rope uncoiled from the window. One end dangled to the ground between the stilts. That must be how he's coming down, Ruth Rose said. Let's take the rope and stilts, Josh whispered. He'll be trapped inside. But Mrs. Davis is in there with him, Ruth Rose said. We have to let him come out, then follow him. One of us should run to the police station now, Dink said. The trouble was no one wanted to leave the excitement. Suddenly, 3 things happened all at once. The upstairs lights blazed on. Dink heard a loud scream. The police whistle blared through the open window. Dink leaped to his feet, not sure what to do. Mrs. Davis was up there, and the burglar was probably in the same room with her. But which one had let out the scream? Dink saw a silhouette appear at the window. A second later, Fred Little was climbing down his escape rope. With his feet still above the ground, he dropped. Suddenly, the backyard exploded with color and noise. A police cruiser roared across Mrs. Davis's lawn. Flashing red, yellow, and blue lights, the backyard looked like a fireworks display. The siren whooped loudly, shutting out the shrieking of the whistle. Then the noise stopped as the cruiser's doors opened. Officers Fallon and Keene leaped out. Hold it! Officer Fallon shouted. Fred Little was still crouched at the ground where he had landed. Dink saw his mouth fall open in panic and surprise. In seconds, he was wearing handcuffs. As Officer Keene led the prisoner to the police car, the back door flew open. Mrs. Davis marched out in a white nightgown and floppy slippers. She flip-flopped across the yard toward Fred Little. Her face was shiny with white cream. Some kind of lacy bonnet covered her hair, and she held a long sword over her head. The nerve of you, she yelled into Fred Little's terrified face, coming right into my bedroom. The sword flashed in the cruiser's headlights. Dink thought she was going to use it on the burglar. I heard you trying to find my jewelry, she shouted, and after I fed you tea and cookies. Come on, Ruth Rose said. Everyone, but especially Fred Little, was surprised to see 3 little ninjas crawl out of the bushes. 3 little ninjas, right? Ruth Rose and Josh and Dink. And look at Mrs. Davis. I don't think I'd want to break into her house. Good for her. Here's chapter 9. Ruth Rose stomped up to Fred Little and glared at him. Where's my tiger? She demanded. Fred Little backed away. What tiger? Tiger's my cat. Did you steal her? Where is she? I didn't take any cat, he muttered. I'm allergic to cats. What are you kids doing here? Officer Fallon asked with a frown. We thought someone might try to break in tonight, Ruth Rose said, pointing at the prisoner. We wanted to get proof so that you could arrest him. This is Fred Little, Josh said, the guy who returned Mrs. Davis's canary. He's also a clown in the circus. And he's probably the one who robbed Dr. Pardue's house and the Gwynns too, Dink added. It certainly looks that way, Officer Fallon said. He gave instructions to Officer Keene, who locked Fred Little in the cruiser and drove away. Officer Fallon looked sternly at Dink. We'll talk tomorrow, he said. You kids better skedaddle home and get some sleep. Fiddlesticks, Mrs. Davis said. These kids won't perish if they stay a little bit longer, and I won't sleep a wink. Come inside for cookies and cocoa, all of you. Officer Fallon just smiled and shook his head as they followed Mrs. Davis into her kitchen. Dink noticed Mozart's cage sitting on the counter. Mrs. Davis put water on to boil and took mugs from the cupboard. Then she pulled the cover off the bird cage. Mozart twittered and blinked his tiny black eyes. You've certainly put everyone through a lot of trouble, she told her canary. Actually, Leona, your canary helped us solve a string of burglaries. Officer Fallon said, I did some snooping and found out a lot about Fred Little and his girlfriend. They've been traveling with the circus and robbing houses in towns they visit for quite some time, and they always do it the same way. First they steal pets, then they return the pets to get a peek inside the houses. Later they rob the same houses. Mrs. Davis shook her head. You should have seen that creepy man's face when I turned on the light. But how did he know I left my upstairs bathroom window open? He probably saw that it was open when he took your canary, Officer Fallon said. Or maybe he left it open, Dink said. He might have snuck upstairs when he used your bathroom. You could be right, Dink, Officer Fallon said. On stilts, he could get into upstairs windows that most people leave unlocked. In the robbery business, he's known as a second-story man. After tonight, Mrs. Davis said, that window will be locked. How did you know that Fred Little would try to break in tonight, Dink asked. We were parked right around the corner, Officer Fallon continued. We figured the burglary had to be tonight or never since the circus leaves tomorrow. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Officer Fallon stood up and stretched. That'll be Officer Keene back with the car. We'll drive you kids home. I hope we didn't wreck your yard, Leona. Oh, pooh, you saved my jewelry and caught a pair of criminals, she said. Besides, I know 3 children who'd like to earn some money by raking and planting grass seed. Officer Fallon laughed. You could have caught Fred Little all by yourself. Where'd that sword come from, Leona? My husband brought it back from one of our trips, she said, smiling. It's been under my bed for years in case I ever needed it. Did you see that guy's face? Josh said. I think he was glad he was going to jail. Officer Fallon and Officer Keene dropped the kids off at Dink's house. Good night, kids, Officer Fallon said. No more sneaking around, okay? The kids promised they'd go right to bed and watch the cruiser drive away. I wonder if Fred Little was telling the truth about Tiger, Ruth Rose said. All the pets got returned except mine. Tomorrow, we'll help you search. Right, Josh? Dink said. Right, Josh said. We'll ring every doorbell in Green Lawn if we have to. Ruth Rose nodded, looking very sad. Thanks, guys. The boys said goodnight to Ruth Rose, then walked around the back and crawled into their tent. Josh giggled in the dark. Did you see Mrs. Davis come flying out her door with all that goop on her face? I thought she was a ghost. Dink grinned. Yeah, and old Fred Little came shooting out the window like a rocket. I bet he burned his hand sliding down that rope. Dink rolled over and closed his eyes. 30 seconds later, Ruth Rose burst through the tent flap. She shined a flashlight in Dink's face. Guys, wake up, she yelled. Josh bolted straight up. Jeez, Ruth Rose, my heart can't take any more surprises tonight. What's wrong? Dink asked, blinking. Tiger came home, Ruth Rose said, flopping down next to Dink's feet. She was on my bed when I snuck upstairs. When I went to pick her up, she hopped down and crawled under the bed. Ruth Rose grinned. And guess what I found under there with her? A sword, Dink guessed. Nope. A burglar? Josh asked, blinking into the flashlight. No, I found 3 kittens. I'm a grandmother. That's a happy ending, isn't it? Canary Caper. So maybe you can check out some A to Z mysteries from the library at some point. Have a great spring break, boys and girls.